Hello everybody. Uh, in this video I'd like to continue our exploration of Owen Shear's relationship to the post-industrial landscape by focusing on one of the slightly more substantial, slightly longer poems in this collection, Border Country. Before I do that though, there are a few interesting bits of context that relate to it. So, Border Country was the title of a 1960 novel by the Welsh academic and writer Raymond Williams, who was born into the Welsh working class as the son of a railway worker, but was able to go away to university and in fact became an academic specialising in English literature and critical theory in England. In the novel, though, the protagonist, a character called Matthew Price, is returning from his job at an English university to visit his dying father in the village where he was brought up, and where he then sort of confronts this village culture that seems unchanged from his childhood. So first of all then, it's worth saying that in the novel itself is a kind of what we can call a sort of fictionalized autobiography, or at least draws heavily on autobiographical elements from Raymond Williams' own life. What Shears does is he draws on both of these. The parallels with his life are quite obvious. A Welsh academic from a comprehensive school who goes away to be educated, to work at an English university, but who finds himself drawn back to his place of origin, which I suppose is reflected in that poem Skirrid Ford that we began with, which also ends the collection, the way in which he's drawn back. So the choice of this title clearly once again relates to this idea of Shears aligning himself with this tradition of Welsh literature. We've mentioned people like R.S. Thomas, for example, although having said that, Shears, as a more global writer, also does draw influences from elsewhere. We mentioned Robert Frost and the poem Stopping by Woods. We mentioned the allusion to Ted Hughes' poem Winds. We mentioned the allusion to R.S. Thomas's 90th birthday in the poem Father as well. So this is very much somebody, it's a statement of ambition, I suppose. This is somebody who is staking a claim for themselves as a writer. In a Welsh tradition, but also in the sort of pantheon of modern poets. So, let's then now proceed to the poem itself. I'll read it first, and then we'll talk about it. Border Country. Nothing marks the car quarry now, just raised earth like the hummock of a grave, a headstone of trees, wind-written epitaphs running in their leaves. Filled in years ago, but still I can't help standing at its edge where the ground once gave to an elephant's graveyard of cars, a motorway pile-up in the corner of the field. One of the places we came when we had tired of catching the commas and apostrophes of minnows and bullheads, or shooting at pumpkins in the field, shouldering the kick of your father's shotgun, or playing at war in the barn, dying again and again under its gap-toothed roof and broken beams. A place where we tested our voices, young as the buzzards above us, striking their cries against the flint sky, smashed black holes in the windows, sat in the driver's seats, going nowhere, operated on engines, dock leaves and nettles running in their pistons, or just walked among them, reading aloud from the names of the dead. Volvo, Ford, Vauxhall, their primary colours rusting to red. Where we lost ourselves in the hours before dark, year on year, until that day when life put on the brakes and pitched you, without notice, through the windscreen of your youth. Your father found at dawn a poppy sown in the unripe corn. I came back once to find the cars smaller or the undergrowth grown, whichever, the whole diminished to steel and stone. Just cars in a quarry, their dashboards undone and the needles of the speedos settled at zero. As I climbed back out, I disturbed a buzzard that flew from its branch like a rag shaken out in the wind, before spiralling upwards above the shuffling trees and on over the fields. The spittle sheep, the ink-dot cows, a tractor writing with its wheels, and on over the lanes, where a boy meandered between the hedges, trailing a stick, kicking a stone, trying once more to find his way home. I must say, I think this is perhaps one of my favourite poems in this collection, one of the more substantial ones, as I say. Um, Before we start to talk through it, it's worth noting that rather like Father, this is a poem which, although the landscape it depicts is clearly post-industrial, we're talking about a quarry that's been reused as a scrapyard and now filled in, but it's very much in the romantic tradition. Once again, he's using these reflections, these recollections of place as a way of exploring these sort of wider themes. He talks about the sort of juxtaposition between childhood and growing up. He talks about that transition in this poem as being quite abrupt. He uses this metaphor of a car crash on the fourth stanza, the metaphor of being pitched without notice through the windscreen of your youth, about being forced to confront growing up. Now, he seems in this poem to be addressing an absent friend from his childhood, and perhaps in a strange way, perhaps he is contrasting this friend compelled to grow up suddenly. But in the final lines of the poem, when he talks about a boy meandering between hedges trying to find his way home, is it perhaps Shears himself he's talking about, the sense that somehow he feels lost in adulthood, the fact that he feels sort of displaced from his heritage and from the place of his upbringing? And this is where I think the poem thematically links back to Raymond Williams's novel Border Country. The idea that the idea of going home and feeling out of place is very much that theme that that Williams explores. So, let's begin. Nothing marks the car quarry now. First of all, it's another poem that begins with a negative, rather like History that we looked at previously. And I suppose there is, particularly in a lot of these landscape poems, there is a certain sort of pervading sense of gloom and of displacement that sits over them. And I think it's heralded from the first word. Nothing marks the car quarry. Now, in that single noun phrase, the car quarry, in a sense, you have 200 years of the history of this landscape smashed into one very heavily weighted phrase. A quarry, a product of the Industrial Revolution, where stone would be extracted, which has subsequently been used as a scrapyard, and so the car quarry. There you have it. And yet, just raised earth like the hummock of a grave, because it's been filled in. Now, when we were talking about the poem Steelworks, the Steelworks, and we talked about how Shears lamented the closure of this sort of Welsh monument. In that poem, we were saying that he didn't really explore what came after. But in this poem, rather like in History, what he's talking about is a landscape that has returned to nature. And so I suppose, once again, we can suggest that these are poems that reflect on man's fundamental insignificance. In the end, the capacity of man to influence these landscapes in any lasting and meaningful way is minimal. It's very much a sort of anti-hubristic poem. Now, when he talks about the image of the hummock of a grave, we're talking about these. The image there is these sort of prehistoric burial mounds. That's the kind of image that he talks about, and it's interesting because he's saying that this rewilded quarry looks no different to something that's 4,000 years old. Nature claims it, and you would never know if, unless, like Shears, you were sort of in on the secret, you would never know that it had been there. But the somber mood continues there because we have that semantic field of the motif. You have grave, headstone, epitaphs. Epitaphs, of course, meaning sort of verse or inscription written after somebody has died. And notice once again you've got this image of the wind, which recurs again and again in these poems as a sort of symbol of adversity, of the challenges of life. Finally, on the fifth line, he tells us that it's filled in years ago, and so very concisely, almost imagistically, in these first lines of this poem, he has filled in the whole picture of the history of this landscape. The fact that Shears himself is remembering the history of the landscape is again, I think, part of his claims to be a part of it. It shows the feelings of belonging that he has for it. Filled in years ago, but still I can't help standing at its edge where the ground once gave. Now, in other words, this links back to the very ending of the poem, because it's this idea that he can't quite let go of his childhood. He can't quite accept the adulthood that he now lives in without looking back. That's the image there. It once gave to an elephant's graveyard of cars a motorway pile-up. Now, there is something almost mythical about this idea of a place where elephants go to die. But the kind of sheer sort of scale and the hyperbole of this image, I think, tells us something about the innocence of childhood, where everything seems so big and so exciting. And if you look at the fifth stanza, when he talks about how he came back once to find the car smaller, it's interesting how it's diminished, how the epic imagery of his childhood that he explores near the beginning of the poem is now reduced in size and scale once he becomes an adult. Incidentally, you have their graveyard and motorway pile-up, which again I think link to that sort of to the sort of semantic field that we mentioned earlier. Now, he continues then. One of the places we came when we had tired of catching the commas and apostrophes of minnows and bullheads. So, I think fishing, therefore, is what's being described, but using, unusually, this sort of punctuation imagery. Rather a strange idea, but I suppose it's a little allusion to the life that Shears has moved into since. Shears, the English literature professor, the English literature academic at a university. And we have these sort of exciting pastimes. But there is another note of caution when he talks here, for example, about shooting at pumpkins in the field, shouldering a kick of your father's shotgun. So it's an exciting childhood, but it's one tinged with danger. Now, in the fourth stanza, when it talks about your father found at dawn, a poppy sown in the unripe corn, the implication is that the father, certainly dead, presumably committed suicide, and the presence of the reference to the gun earlier in the poem implies that perhaps may have used the gun to do so. So I suppose, in a sense, then, the reference to the gun there is sort of foreshadowing towards that moment. And similarly, it was almost Blood Brothers-like, the reference to playing at war in the barn. Again, it's this idea of childhood as being a kind of risk-free rehearsal for real life. the casual reference to dying again and again. But again, much like Blood Brothers, of course, it's dying without consequences, dying without death. Childhood as a game. It's interesting that this takes place in this barn, which itself is described as being gap-toothed and broken. The image gap-tooth particularly implies its age, almost personified in that sense, represents it with age. And we get this general sense of neglect. This is a landscape that has not prospered, and certainly had not prospered up to Shears's childhood. The Industrial Revolution had been and gone, the quarry had shut down. It's a deprived landscape here that he's talking about. For all that, that this is clearly not a pastoral sort of image. It's almost like living in the sort of remnants of a dying civilization. The third stanza, though, continues, a place where we tested our voices, young as the buzzards above us, striking their cries against a flint sky. Now, I think here the reference to the sort of symbol of buzzards, which are again referred to at the end of the fifth stanza, is intended as a reference to freedom, and I think therefore in a sense reflects something aspirational for these young people, earthbound as they are. We see then more detail about the pastimes, that they smashed black holes in the windows, sat in the driver's seats, going nowhere, operated on engines. I suppose the going nowhere element is where the clear juxtaposition to the buzzards come in. They are playing at going somewhere. They are playing at having opportunities that for most people growing up in rural Wales they would not have had. Shears in that sense is the exception, or is an exception, in that he was able to leave and be educated in that sort of sense. But again, the macabre imagery continues. You've got things like the black holes in windows. You've got that image of operated on engines as if it's something almost surgical. So that sense of bleakness really sort of drives this poem. Once again, there is emphasis on the rewilding element, which links back to at the very beginning of the poem, about the quarry looking like a hummock of a grave. The reference to dock leaves and nettles running in their pistons. And it's the theme that we keep seeing about the way that he uses these sort of industrial images. Think back to, for example, things like the oil in history. The way that he uses these rather industrial images to describe the natural world that's returning, as if when Shears sees it, he sees and hears the echoes of the industrial life that had been there. But it continues, or just walked among them, reading aloud from the names of the dead, Volvo, Ford, Vauxhall. Again, it's a kind of epitaph for an industrial age. Their primary colours rusting to red, again returning to nature, where we lost ourselves in the hours before dark. The hours before dark, once again then, we have the growing sense of foreboding that comes with this poem and with all these images that we've talked about. The hours before dark, hours towards the end of a life. Year on year, until that day when life put on the brakes and pitched you without notice through the windscreen of your youth. In other words, the stasis, the state of not going anywhere, of life as a game of their childhood, is ended by this sudden violent shock. And notice in this poem, growing up is a violent shock, which is seemingly the death of this friend's father. And we have the classic Shears long dash pause, and then this rather lovely metaphor, a poppy sown in the unripe corn. Of course, we have the image of the poppy, which with its colouring is very much associated with blood and with death. The fact that it is described as being unripe corn, I think, therefore emphasises that his father died before his time. That adjective there, I think, is quite significant. And the image of the poppy is a reminder of the fragility of human life. Contrast that to things like the hummock of the grave, the solidity of the landscape and the way that landscape endures, that nature endures, with the sheer temporariness of the human life that's explored. So, for most of this poem that we've read to the moment, it describes the times they used to go there as children. The poem starts in the present, nothing marks the car quarry now, but then the way, on the sort of sixth line, when he talks about standing at its edge where the ground once gave, that then triggers the sort of flashback to the childhood, which then continues through the next three stanzas. But in stanza 5, he depicts one later visit as an adult, but some years ago. I came back once to find the cars smaller or the undergrowth grown, whichever, the whole diminished to steel and stone. This is what we were saying earlier. Linking back is a contrast to the kind of epic imagery of things like the elephant's graveyard, the sense that in adulthood the world does not have quite the same mystery and excitement that it had in his childhood. And the scale of that diminishment emphasised by the sibilance of the steel and the stone. Just cars in a quarry, nothing exciting, not an elephant's graveyard anymore, but simply the banal reality, the banal post-industrial reality. Their dashboards undone and the needles of the speedos settled at zero. Now, that alludes back to the image going nowhere in the middle of stanza 3, but it sort of reinforces it, doesn't it? It's the idea that actually childhood seems to have been, for all its entertainment, this time of fairly futile aspiration that they were incapable at the time of acting on. It's significant after he has had this revelation, when it describes then that as I climbed back out, I disturbed a buzzard that flew from its branch like a rag. It's interesting then that he returns to the buzzard, which we said at the beginning of this poem was, in stanza 3 of this poem, was a symbol of freedom. It's interesting that he disturbs one, that his attention is suddenly drawn to it now, and it's a reminder of that freedom which he hoped for, and which I suppose he thought that adulthood would provide. But the fact now that the buzzard, which was once striking its cries, is now described as being using this similarly merely like a rag. In contrast to the previous image, its cries against a flint sky, the idea of a buzzard as being something that is tough and hard against the landscape where even the sky seems stony, never mind the land. And we talked about images of that in previous poems. Excuse me. You could also link the flint sky image to the idea of the sort of metal sky that's explored at the end of the steelworks as well. But the fact that now this buzzard is diminished to being simply like a rag, even what seemed like that symbol of hope and freedom is in itself diminished, a rag shaken out in the wind. Far from these great buzzards taking on the sky, it seems like it itself is no more than a plaything, a pawn in the face of nature and time. But he looks to it It spirals upwards above the shuffling trees and on over the fields. The buzzard then flies away. Still, he sees it as a sign of hope, and once again we have this classic pause from Shears, this heavily end-stopped line that introduces his sort of synthesis, that introduces his kind of conclusion, as it were. The spittle sheep, the ink dot cows. See how everything is diminished, partly because there's a sense of it being perhaps the buzzard's eye view, but again I think it links back to the idea of the cars being smaller, the fact that all these things that seem so significant in childhood now do not seem so. A tractor then writing with its wheels. Notice, by the way, another return to the sort of punctuation stroke writing imagery that we mentioned earlier, and on over the lanes where a boy meandered between the hedges, trailing a stick, kicking a stone, trying once more to find his way home. He's looking back on himself now at a kind of distance, and again it reflects these feelings of displacement. He is someone who has grown up and has moved away from his home, and yet clearly is not completely secure in his new surroundings, because this is somewhere that he returns to, looking to sort of commune with these experiences, these feelings, these securities of his past. So, to clarify, chronology-wise then, the poem begins in the present, returns back to the childhood, and then it flashes forward once to his younger adulthood, and then again seemingly to the present day, but also looks back at the end in a sense. Because in a sense he describes himself, that metaphor, as a boy. He still feels that sense of a boy. I suppose in a way he thought that adulthood would bring freedom and independence like the buzzard, and while perhaps in some ways it has, in other ways he still feels like the same boy that he once was. Now, beyond that, there isn't really too much else to say. As we said, the way that he uses this sort of reflection of landscape to draw out these themes, as we said, is a profoundly romantic idea, but it is one that is grounded in the post-industrial landscape that we see. On that note, I think we'll conclude this video, and we'll pick up again shortly in the next one. Thank you very much.